we can start, and then others will join.
Okay, great. So without further ado, let me just jump in with the last slide and continue on. Just a quick recap. I think in the previous two lectures, I gave you a bird's eye view of the story of quantum everything, coming from physics into chemistry and now biochemistry and possibly biology. We will talk about this today. And the two important concepts I think that we will try to emphasize today is the concept of photons, so quanta of light, electromagnetic energy, and phonons, which very seldom actually are mentioned in connection with quantum biology, but they are, in my opinion, equally important. These are the quanta of mechanical vibrations in solids like crystals and so on. Okay, so I told you about the hierarchical organization of science, and so we are trying to traverse it. The pathway is not linear, and it shouldn't be, and it's also complicated because each manifold defining a given area of science has its own not only elements and interactions between elements, but also the rules of the game. And trying to derive everything, as we call ab initio, from the beginning, that means from, let's say, quantum field theory, describe the DNA. That's an impossible task because these rules change, and each field develops its own shortcuts. You cannot do Darwinian evolution using quantum chromodynamics. I mean, that just doesn't cut it. But we do try to bridge the gap between different. Oh, sorry, I should actually go to slide mode. We do try to bridge different gaps at different levels of space and time or units, and that kind of ideally we can at least see overlap between different models, and this shows you where we are at in terms of bridging the gap toward at least the cell level modeling or beyond, and these are on the y-axis you have the length scale, starting from, let's say, angstroms, corresponding to atoms, nanometers, to macromolecules, micrometers, organelles and cells, and millimeters, tissues, and so on. And then you have the time scale, which is also important in this because we want to see dynamics, and quantum mechanics, of course, is a very dynamical theory. So the units of time, starting from, let's say, atomic or molecular vibrations, I should say, are picoseconds, and then we have nanosecond scales in the macromolecular level, microseconds, starting to go into the subcellular structures, millisecond, cellular seconds, into continuum models of cells and tissues and beyond. So at these different scales, you have 4 levels of descriptions, and the first one is quantum mechanical. And the first box in the left corner at the bottom. Then you go into atomistic models, which are typically actually they represent each atom as a ball and bonds as sticks. It is quasi-classical, but you can incorporate elements of quantum into it, and there are some models called quantum mechanics, molecular mechanics, that combine the two. And then beyond that, you go into coarse-grained models where you represent groups of molecules, let's say an amino acid as a single mass point, and then go beyond to continuum models where you lose basically all the grainness of matter, and everything becomes fluid-like, let's say cytoplasm, and then you have some coarse-grained representations of things like microtubules, actin filaments, membranes and so on. So that just gives you an idea what we can and cannot do currently. For example, you could not do quantum mechanical simulations of DNA for let's say milliseconds, or proteins even classically for milliseconds. So there are serious limitations computationally, and of course this changes with time because our computational capabilities, both in software and hardware, are improving exponentially with Moore's law. So so that is optimistic. However, and now we come to a real clincher. There is a real barrier, computational barrier that we cannot overcome for a very simple reason. I told you about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle that throws a monkey wrench into our concept of the universe being knowable. Even a single particle is not knowable completely. But the combinatorial barrier tells us that there is a kind of magic number. It's called Elsasser's immense number, or the immense number simply, which is a number of elements in a set that provides a real limit to our computability. So if you have a set of objects or replicas, let's say possibilities, any set that you would like to enumerate or classify, etc., etc. If that set has that number of elements, and I'll tell you that there are many such sets, you will never, ever be able to do that classification job. The simplest, just to go through each element in the set, because of the following assumption that imagine the entire universe being a supercomputer, and in the every particle in this in the universe will be a computing element, a bit, then and the computation would occur over the age of the universe with the speed of flipping each bit on a picosecond timescale, which is, as you recall, atomic level speed. Then the product of these two numbers, the size of the computer and the number of processes you can perform during the age of the universe, which is about 14.5 billion years, in seconds. So that number is 10 to the power of 110. In other words, if a set that you'd like to inspect or analyze is that big or bigger, the entire universe working as a computer with every atom being a computational unit and flipping every picosecond from the beginning, from the Big Bang until now, wouldn't be able to do it. And you might ask, is this realistic? Is it actually a fantasy? Well, it's not, because, for example, a typical globular protein will have about 500 amino acids, and each amino acid comes, from the set of 20 naturally occurring ones. So you have, in the case of just this size of protein, 20 to the power of 500 possibilities. So if you wanted to create a set of all proteins which are 500 amino acids long, or even from, let's say, 100 to 500 would be even greater, but I'm just giving you a simple example. Then then the number is 2 to the power of 500 instead of 10 to the power of 110, which far exceeds the immense number. So the set of potentially existing amino acid sequences is way greater than the immense number of Elsasser. Therefore, that poses a real challenge to the knowability of many things, including biological systems. And the same applies to the DNA sequences, genes, even chess games, by the way. So that's kind of a downer, but at the same time, I would say it gives us some room for creativity, because that would allow computational brute force to compute everything. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any need for conceptual breakthroughs. All right, so that was just a kind of comic relief, I guess. But so now to the question of quantum biology. Finally, so this is more of a historical observation. It took us as a civilization 300 years to develop quantum physics from, let's say, from the age of Newton, 350 or so, to quantum physics, and our human civilization exists about 10,000 years, right? So compare it to 2 billion years of life on this planet, roughly, and compare it to the number of parallel experiments in terms of creating life forms on this planet. And each experiment is also or can be viewed as a form of optimization because of Darwinian evolution, survival of the fittest, adaptation, mutations that provide us with the possibilities of optimizing things in future generations, etc. So what I'm arguing here is that what we've achieved as a human race on a very tiny time scale would be kind of an affront to nature if nature couldn't do it over 2 billion years with all these parallel experiments taking place in the laboratory called Earth. Therefore, I'm sure that quantum principles and quantum mechanisms, which are very efficient and very useful, and I'll tell you why in a minute, must have been adapted by biology in some form. And we are just discovering now. And I think the story kind of parallels the story of quantum physics, because as you recall from the first lecture, only about 5 or 6 experiments remained challenged, at the beginning of the 20th century, about 5 or 6 experiments were a challenge to classical physics. The rest was very well explained. In biology, it seems we're explaining a lot of things, except for a few things, maybe a few experiments, a few examples that are hard to explain using some kind of traditional biological thinking hats. Okay, so that's just a historical parallel, and you can see here Darwin on the right and Schrödinger looking very suspiciously at us, and he was already thinking about biology, and trust me, in 1943 when he wrote What is Life. So, but it took a long time actually to reach a point of getting some examples of quantum biological systems. And I also want to mention the importance of these experiments in physics, which I highlighted in the first 2 lectures. The importance of the ones that I'll talk about in biology shortly has to do with the essence of life, namely what is essential to all living systems. There are a few characteristics, but one of which is, of course, replication, self-replication, and another one which is characteristic of living systems, and this is the one that I want to emphasize, metabolism. There is no living system that survives without metabolism taking place. Viruses can kind of live in suspended animation without metabolism for a while, then they find a host. It really is a borderline. But other than that, starting from bacteria on, every living system requires energy supply, metabolic energy supply, transduction, and energy consumption for survival and living processes. So why am I saying this? Because metabolism in the form of exists in two major forms: in plants, photosynthesis, and in animals, oxidative phosphorylation through mitochondria. And these two are the key examples where we will be discussing quantum biology at work, starting with photosynthesis. But before we get there, I will discuss both pros and cons of quantum concepts in biology, because there's a lot of people that are doubting this, have been doubting it, and for good reasons, of course. There are some good arguments against these concepts to be introduced into biology. Other than the trivial, as I mentioned, the trivial argument that, all chemistry is quantum, therefore all biochemistry is quantum, therefore all biology is quantum. That's trivial. We need to go deeper, and these deeper aspects will be discussed today. So, all right, fragility of quantum states as we construct them in physical laboratories. That means they can be easily disrupted by environmental effects, noise, thermal noise, temperature, and so on. So typically, we study quantum systems in very cold temperatures and in isolation. This is kind of opposite to life, right? Because life takes place at warm temperatures, comfortable temperatures. Humans have a very narrow range of temperatures and body temperatures that they can survive at. And the second thing is the isolation. So isolation meaning for physical systems, no interference with external forces. And of course, biological systems are open. Metabolism requires complete access to nutritional resources, oxygen, etc. So this is a list of criticism or critical remarks that the doubters in quantum biology pose frequently. So as I mentioned, and I will respond to some of that. The first one is life is big. So at least cells. So cells are much larger than individual atoms or molecules in comparison to photons, electrons. Yeah, but I told you that quantum effects also exist in macroscopic systems such as crystals and magnets and lasers. So that's a kind of bogus argument, completely to be discounted. There's really, it's a joke, I would say. The second is life is hot compared to physical liquid nitrogen or something, liquid helium temperatures, where some of the quantum systems are best studied. Well, that is true, but yet again, we have counter examples to quantum systems. With quantum systems in physics surviving at reasonably large temperatures, high temperatures, including high temperature superconductivity, which I don't know what the record is now, but it was more than 100 degrees Kelvin. They started with something like 16, so you can improve quite a bit. There are also other examples of quantum systems, even at room temperature. Of course, magnets. I don't have to go further. And I want to emphasize also the statistical aspect that last time I highlighted there's something missing even in the quantum biology literature, because the hallmarks of quantum behavior do not require direct mechanistic intervention. It could be indirect observation of some statistical property like specific heat. Then of course there's the question of water. So life is wet, so our bodies are composed 70% to about 70% of water molecules, and therefore water being very fluid and unstable could disrupt quantumness. True, but again, tap water is not what living organisms create in themselves. In fact, there's a growing body of literature demonstrating that biological water in cells is highly organized, and that would actually not only prevent quantum effects from happening, but maybe even be conducive to them. There are some papers, in fact, discussing this, that water, biological water, is part and parcel of the quantum field creation inside living systems. I would point in the direction of the work of Giuseppe Vitiello from Italy, for example, and groups in Japan that studied this aspect. Then the question of timescales, well, again, these are very qualitative aspects. There exist also examples of quantum states in physics that can be that have been extended to seconds, and of course, importantly, quantum physics is typically concerned with equilibrium systems. That means no energy supply, and biological systems, I told you about metabolism, constantly receive energy. This energy can replenish the excitations that are required for the maintenance of quantum states. So that's the counter argument to slowness. You can repump it, just like relay stations for underwater cables transmitting internet signals. You have to amplify them periodically. Quantum states in biological systems can be re-energized by metabolic energy supply. And then, of course, life is complex. Yes, that means that we are simply not sophisticated enough to understand hierarchical organization of living systems and how quantum systems can be actually happy in a hierarchically organized environment, because all of physics until recently has been dealing with simple, let's say, well-organized, structured systems, and it requires a bit more complex theory development to. So that's again an argument which I think is bogus. And life is not fuzzy, so it doesn't require some sort of superposition or wave function. I think it's just a matter of perception, a philosophical argument. I'm not quite sure if I would agree with this, because every millisecond decisions are made by cells about their fate, and these decisions basically could be considered to be some kind of a collapse of the wave function, which is recreated and collapsing and recreated and collapsing every period of time. So that's neither here nor there, I think. And the question that life is real rather than hypothetical in uncertainty, well, that again, it's more philosophical. The reality of reality, I guess, is like discussion for philosophers. Quantum mechanics puts some question marks on that. What is reality? Is it objective, subjective? But that really doesn't speak to the question of whether biology can be quantum or not. All right, and again, I said that Mother Nature has been experimenting with optimizing its products, biological systems, over 2 billion years with trillions and trillions of copies. So some of these questions of creating quantum systems which are complex and complicated and immersed in noisy environments can be and have been addressed by ongoing experimentation. Okay, so this is my response to the critics. It doesn't mean that I don't have any questions myself, but these objections, in my opinion, are not really very strong. So on the other hand, there are a lot of questions in biology that molecular biology or kind of traditional approaches, classical biology, biochemistry, have great difficulty addressing and providing a conceptual framework even for these. And one of them at the top is the nature of collective dynamics. So again, we have systems of huge numbers of degrees of freedom, and yet biological systems and subsystems of a given system organize themselves and respond collectively, not randomly, not individually. So even a singular organism is a collection of cells and cells of proteins and proteins of amino acids. How all of this can be understood as a collective dynamical system. Now the second is out of thermodynamic equilibrium. I mentioned to you already that that's a bit of a difficulty for physics. Most of, not all, but most of physics for quantum mechanics does not traditionally operate in a situation out of thermodynamic equilibrium with, let's say, quasi-periodic supply of energy. So we don't have really a very good grasp on this kind of thing. There have been attempts in the past. Quantum thermofield dynamics was developed actually by one of the professors in our department of physics at the University of Alberta, Professor Hirumi Umezawa, who passed away some years ago. And incidentally, he also developed quantum brain dynamics theory. So he introduced, as the first proponent, quantum concepts for neuroscience. So he dealt simultaneously with this out of thermodynamic equilibrium within quantum physics, or field theory to be specific, and worked with the neuroscience concepts from the quantum point of view. Then this hierarchy of organization already mentioned, that's difficult because we have to connect between different scales, spatial and time scales, and structural. And yeah, the complexity is similar. It's order, quasi-order without really a repetition per se. For example, you look at the DNA sequence, it looks periodic when you consider each nucleic acid as a bead, but then of course we put the letters on these beads, and each letter changes, A, T, G, C, and so on, and it's not periodic at all. And then the next one is kind of a difficult one too, because in biology both short and long range correlations and interactions exist. So that means you have to take into account both the sort of immediate neighborhood and also long range correlations, which is difficult, not impossible. And then the open irreversible dissipative systems. I will come to this point in a second, because that leads to things like pattern formation. How do patterns emerge in morphology in biological systems, in the evolution of species, in the evolution of individuals, and so on. And then, of course, self-organization. Self-organization of these systems is a problem that was tackled in the 70s and 80s by physicists and biologists. And for example, Hermann Haken in Germany introduced the concepts of self-organized dynamical systems. And then homeostasis, which is key to biological systems, and that is staying within equilibrium even when under constant influx of material, information, perturbations, etc., interactions. So, and then of course nonlinearity, that is in biology nothing is easily or well understood with with a proportionality between cause and effect. There's always this sigmoidal curve with ignition and then nonlinear or even exponential growth, and then saturation and stagnation and so on. So these are all the difficult, maybe not all of them are unsolved, but very difficult to put them all together. Okay. Now to the definitions of, so finally we can come to the point where we discuss the definition of quantum biology as a field. It's a very nascent field, new and evolving. So I'm just quoting from Wikipedia. So this refers to quantum biology refers to applications of quantum mechanics to biological objects and problems. But I mentioned earlier, these are supposed to be non-trivial, and this is the list of non-trivial features of quantum systems, okay? Not that something is just composed of chemical molecules. So the first one is superposition. So what does superposition means? It means that that a given system, let's say, could exist at the same time in two states or more. So that's one of the postulates, main postulates of quantum mechanics, that a solution to a quantum equation can be superimposed with another solution, and that superposition is a valid solution. So that's kind of difficult because the system can at some point in time be in two states at the same time or more, and that's a classical case of the so-called Schrödinger cat. And that was a mind experiment, a thought experiment, where a cat was in a cage, not seen to the experimenter, and was able to I guess drink from a poison well, but the poison would be released when a radioactive element would undergo a disintegration, and there was a quantum effect, and therefore until you open the cage, the cat can be either dead or alive, and that's the Schrödinger cat. So we can't really conceive of living systems per se being in two states at the same time. I'm exactly here at this desk. You are in Edmonton. You cannot be simultaneously in two places at the same time. But whether this goes, that far necessarily is not the case. We can be talking about, let's say, tunneling of ions across an ion channel, and the ion can be in a superposition of states, either in front of the channel or on the cellular side of the channel, and then or maybe a phosphate group can be attached to an ADP molecule, forming ATP, or away and being in a quantum superposition. So you can imagine a lot of examples at the level of molecules in living systems of importance to them that can be in kind of quantum superposition states. But there's even a further speculation, I guess, that you can imagine how the mind works and how the brain functions, where we can think of the processes that the brain goes through as being in superposition. You can be thinking simultaneously about two things, or the brain may be in superposition of states in terms of emotional and intellectual and physiological and so on. So superposition can take various meanings. So throwing this out is not so easy, even at the macroscopic scale. And I guess, I hope we'll have time to speak about this topic a little bit next week. Non-locality yeah, so this is a tough one. That's this concept of quantum reality not being determined by local space-time values, but something at an arbitrary distance, kind of related to this entanglement, next one, where two particles can be in some sort of shared state or function at an arbitrary distance from each other. Again, it's hard to imagine this to apply to some trivial biological examples, but you can again come back to it when discussing our brains, how we can be entangled, let's say emotionally or mentally, with somebody even at a long distance through thoughts, even dreams. In dreams you can have some premonitions or let's say messages from somebody who is very close to you, so therefore entangled from far away. I don't know if you've had any such experiments, not experiments, but experiences. I haven't, and many people did, and there's a lot of reports of this. So quantum mechanics would explain these kinds of experiences. I don't know what else can do it. All right, and then the last one is tunneling. So these are the key quantum properties. Tunneling, I mentioned to you earlier, is when a particle that normally has not enough energy to overcome a barrier, in quantum mechanics, it can simply tunnel through it if its wavelength is larger than the size of the barrier. It's a bit like imagine a tennis ball, not as a ball of, let's say, I don't know what the size is, let's say 8 centimeters diameter, but its wave function would be 50 centimeters instead, and therefore if you hit the wall that is 20 centimeters thick, there will be a probability it will simply tunnel through it if it was a quantum tennis ball. I'm thinking about tennis because I haven't played it in almost a year, and I'm looking forward to it. So now, where is tunneling happening in biology? Well, for example, tunneling of electrons in the electron transport chain in mitochondria has been touted as occurring on a quantum basis, and some catalytic reactions involve tunneling, as well as again potential some ions crossing the ion channels. So yeah, this is a list of potential effects. Now let's go to some examples of manifestations of quantum behavior in biology. I want to mention some names of people that thought about this many years ago already, and this is a short list of important names in physics that were involved in quantum biology thinking without doing really much, but just proposing it. Niels Bohr, you recall his contributions, Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, John von Neumann, the creator of computer science, among other things, Carl von Weizsäcker, Elsasser that I mentioned, Weizkopf, Eugene Wigner, Freeman Dyson, one of the greatest thinkers of 20th century, and Arthur Koestler. So they all have noticed the importance of quantum aspects, and they claim that quantum mechanics is essential for understanding life. I don't think it means that all aspects of living systems or life in general must be quantum, but some essential ones should be. And I'll come back to it in a few minutes what is this essential, and I kind of gave away the answer: metabolism, for example, and consciousness, another example, to which we'll come back next week. So some people call it speculative, interdisciplinary field that links quantum physics and the life sciences. And I think all breakthroughs in science always are speculative in the beginning, and then they end up being established and accepted by all. Okay, so sorry. So this is a short list that I created, where essential quantum concepts have been proposed for living systems. Quantum metabolism, we'll talk about it in some detail. Biophotons, that is the emission of light by systems which are alive, biological systems. When they metabolize, they emit biophotons. It's called ultra-weak emission and has been measured. This is biophotonics is a reasonably well understood field, and there are a lot of papers on this. And then photosynthesis kind of is the flip side. Biophotons is emission of photons by living systems, and photosynthesis is the absorption of photons by some systems for the purpose of energy creation. And these systems are plants, their leaves, they harvest light, and bacteria, and also some amoeba. Then there were theories, very interesting and very provocative, and not fully confirmed experimentally, but still worth talking about. The Davidoff-Soliton theory, which means that in some specially arranged biological structures, such as alpha helices and proteins and DNA, the mechanical vibrations called phonons interact with electronic excitons and form couples that travel along this alpha helix without energy loss. That would help us understand some energy correlations over relatively large distances in living systems, because local collisions are not really very efficient in energy transfer. Okay, then of course, again, cognition, entanglement, quantum computation in our neurons. That's another topic that has been discussed a lot. And finally, long-range coherent excitations by Herbert Froelich. This is another proposed theory from the 70s that is still being debated and even experimentally verified recently to some degree. What it says is that energy delivery to living systems can create a coherent excitation on a large scale, involving oscillating dipole moments, and that is in a metastable state, and therefore can trap electromagnetic energy, and that's at the basis very much quantum. Okay, so is quantum mechanics relevant to biology? I hope I convinced you, although we haven't really got through this in great detail, that at small enough scales, definitely, because of the biochemistry and some of these examples of tunneling, etc. At larger scales, it's hotly debated, I guess, but it's not ruled out. So these are two examples of kind of macro scale quantum systems in biology. This is on the left. You have a picture of a so-called FMO photosynthetic complex in as I mentioned, in the chlorophyll of plants, and in some bacteria that also utilize light energy for metabolic purposes. And that actually unleashed this quantum revolution, as you can see here, 2007, 8, etc., and continues until now. And then there is another macro example, magnetoreception. So navigating migratory birds like European robins are claimed to use quantum processes to orient themselves along the magnetic field lines of the Earth and find their destinations perfectly. This is a very interesting case where the strength of the interactions between the magnetic field of the Earth and the sort of microscopic compass that the bird contains is so tiny. This force is so tiny. There is really no mechanical possibility of explaining how the bird can sense it unless it has a quantum mechanical component, and that has been explained in these papers from 2004 and 11. It's a bit, I must admit, complex, the explanation, but convincing at the same time. So magnetoreception, bird migration, navigation, and they detect the tiny changes in the angle with respect to the magnetic field lines, and they follow the direction that they need to follow. And that's from one of these papers illustrating how the bird navigates. And I think the signals are received through the retina. There are cryptochrome molecules with two entangled electrons, actually, two electrons of opposite spin in a so-called singlet state. And when the magnetic field changes, the energies between these singlet and triplet states split, and then one of the electrons can trigger well, undergoes a state transition, and triggers subsequent cascade of signals that eventually inform the neurons of the bird's brain to change the direction, to realign and return to the original organization of these two electrons in this cryptochrome molecule. It's fascinating, but the papers on this topic have been published in reputable journals in physics and I think science, and that's quite amazing. It's a tiny little compass, simply composed of two electrons in a molecular system. Okay, now there are also physiological quantum effects, which I'll not discuss too much in detail, except for one or two. And of course, the first one, detection of light by the human eye, is a quantum process. The rods and cones in the retina of the human eye have receptors that become excited by a single photon or two photons. Experiments on this have been done many years ago and illustrated statistically, by the way, that a small number of photons is sufficient to trigger a perception of light. Just like in the photoelectric effect that Einstein got Nobel Prize for, remember, this is a photoreceptor basically acting on individual photons that eject electrons, and then the cascade of subsequent reactions causes the brain to perceive the signal. Another one is olfaction, sense of smell. And that's, I have to admit, it's somewhat debatable, but there are many arguments that the traditional lock and key principle in biology for the, when applied to olfaction, to receptors of smell, does not explain it. There is no shape matching or anything like that, as opposed to many other examples where it does. But in this case, no. However, there is a well documented and argued counter proposal of olfaction involving resonant interaction between the vibrational degrees of freedom of molecules of some kind of odor or of smell and the receptors. So it's not shape matching and ligand binding, but it's really based on the quantum mechanical vibrational resonance. Okay, I mentioned migratory bird navigation, photosynthesis. We'll discuss it a bit more. And then there is a mitochondrial metabolism, which involves this. I don't know if you're familiar with the biochemistry of metabolic reactions. It's very complicated, but oxidative phosphorylation occurs in the mitochondria, and the mitochondrial inner mitochondrial wall has 5 protein complexes, and there is a lot of reactions taking place. I can't go into detail, but what's indispensable is the electron transfer chain and the electrons propagating between these 5 complexes, and they do quantum tunneling and so-called hopping over distances which are not explainable by classical concepts. So that aspect is one critical element of metabolism, but there is more, and the other aspect is that metabolism scales with size in a non-linear way, and that leads to quantum metabolism theory proposed by Lloyd Demetrius, and I'll say a little bit more on this because it's worth exploring, as it really parallels one of those developments of quantum physics into condensed matter physics, namely specific heats of solids. And I mentioned Debye. That's exactly how it goes. You can explain scaling laws using quantization of metabolic reaction correlations, just like specific heat of solids was explained by vibrations of molecules and atoms in a crystal, and these vibrations called phonons are quantized just like photons are vibrations, electromagnetic field oscillations. So very strong parallel between 2 aspects on this list: photosynthesis involving quanta of light, electromagnetic quanta of photons, and then quantum metabolism involving quantization of oscillations in mechanical sense, or phonons. Okay, and then this is the kind of question marks ongoing and very much in the public spotlight these days. There's a lot of articles, even in the popular literature and Wired magazines and all kinds of other sources of information, and that is about whether consciousness itself is a quantum process, fundamentally, not incidentally, but fundamentally. And that goes back to Sir Roger Penrose. Some of you may know Roger Penrose got the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2020 for his fundamental contributions to cosmology and other fields of physics, black holes, etc. But he also, in the 1990s, wrote books on the fundamental questions of our human mind, and proposed that the human mind must operate quantum mechanically, not algorithmically, and there is no classical way that can explain the way we think. And yeah, that's with a question mark. And the flip side of consciousness, of course, is lack of consciousness, and you can do it by anesthesia, reversibly in most cases, luckily, if it works. And so whether, how is it that anesthetics can turn off consciousness? And if consciousness is a quantum, then anesthetics do some kind of quantum switch. And I have to say, I've been involved in this personally for the past, in the past 2 years, from 2021 to 2022, we received a grant from the Templeton Foundation to provide experimental evidence that anesthetics can quench quantum degrees of freedom in some systems, biological systems, and these systems that we examined were microtubules, because according to Penrose and his collaborator Stuart Hameroff, the seat or the fundamental substrate for consciousness in the brain are microtubules of neurons, and therefore, if anesthetics, if this is where quantum states exist, first of all, we need to show that they do. And secondly, if they exist, how can anesthetics turn them off or quench them? So we spent 2 years doing experiments at Princeton with the collaboration of, in fact, Sir Roger Penrose and Bruce McIver from Stanford, who is a noted neurophysiologist, anesthesiologist, Stuart Hameroff, and other set of experiments at the University of Central Florida. And it was managed at the University of Alberta. And so we published one paper on this, and I'm trying to find time to write an opinion piece for Nature on this, because it's a very interesting and critical aspect of consciousness in a quantum sense. I'll talk about it next week, because I think it's really interesting, and I need to comment on the results, which add some weight to this discussion. But the last item on the list is protein folding. One of those until recently unsolved problems, and it was touted that quantum search processes guide proteins to fold into their crystal structures, and maybe even gene mutations, something like jumping gene theory can be occurring as a result of quantum tunneling. That will explain, some mutational facility and probabilities, but whether it's true or not, again, we don't know yet. So this is, maybe I'll finish with this slide, because I mentioned to you the theory of olfaction that shows you the shape matching kind of theory. You have odorants and odorant receptors, and that will be shape matching or lock and key. But there are some problems with this, because there is no such shape matching for many of the odors, and you would have to have a gazillion of receptors. However, resonances would be quite different. You don't need to have a perfect shape matching. You just need to have comparable, close enough comparable resonant frequency of vibrational modes of these molecules, and that would explain it, rather than traditional lock and key principle proposed by Linus Pauling and so on. I'll stop now, because I know that Kim needs to leave in a minute, and we'll continue. We'll complete actually this series next week with probably the most interesting examples, and hopefully we'll have time for some questions as well.
Okay, well, we look forward to that next Tuesday. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, bye-bye.